Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today, my guest is Michael Solomon. He's not just an ordinary citizen who has had enough with the rhetoric from politicians on both sides of the aisle, but he's a pundit. He's been on CNBC and MSNBC and various other stations, Fox as well. Now, he believes that it's a time to fight back, to talk about the issues, to really get into the meat of what is going on in our society today with regard to politics and various other issues. And today we're going to be discussing climate change and various other things surrounding what's going on in the government. So he's a guest of our show on many occasions, and I'm just so delighted to welcome him back. My guest today, again, is Michael Solomon. Welcome to our show, Michael Solomon.
Susan, it's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm so glad to be here.
Well,
it's always fun
I'm
with you.
Very pleased myself, and this is what I want to start with, because you think people know these things, but they don't always. So the issue really is, what is global warming, and how is it different from climate change and climate variability?
Global warming is a political statement that's been made throughout the last 30, 40, actually since 1991, when Al Gore decided that he's going to start this whole new climate, global change, frightening, scare, or whatever you want to call it, nightmare that he's got the world believing in. It's amazing because let's go back to the beginning. Al Gore claimed, and he did this on television, on CNN. I don't have a copy of the interview, but I'm sure it's there somewhere, maybe on YouTube. But Al Gore told his interviewer that he got his theory of global warming. Remember, it's still a theory of global warming after he read Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear. Michael Crichton stated in an interview afterwards that it's totally impossible because, number one, his book was totally fiction. He wrote it in a sense so that people would believe it was scientific and real, but it wasn't. Totally fiction. So he got his whole theory from that. I mean, the same way he said he invented the internet. So I don't know where this man's coming from, but I do know this: that after the Kyoto Protocol, Al Gore was set up in a company after he left the vice presidency called Generation Investment Management, and you can look at that company because there is three people who were involved in that company. Well, actually, two people. There's two principals. The former vice president of the United States, Al Gore, and David Blood was a former chief of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. The company is set up in the UK offshore, probably for tax purposes. But according to the Forbes magazine and the Wall Street Journal, they're accumulating approximately $218 million a year from the sale of carbon credits. Now, let me tell you how carbon credits work, because a lot of people don't realize it. If you have two companies, Company A, Company B, and they are operating in a country that signed the Kyoto Protocol, they're allowed X number of units of carbon credit. It's like a BTU. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. Anyway, so Company A has a lousy manufacturing year, and Company B is running two shifts, and they're pumping products out like crazy, and they're going to run out of carbon credits. They need to buy the 50 left over from Company A. They can buy them from Company A, but they must go through a broker, and that broker is Generation Investment Management. They broker the carbon credits, so you can't buy them direct. It's almost like trying to sell your house without a real estate broker. Only in this case, you need the broker. And in 2011, they accumulated $218 million from the sale of carbon credits. They're averaging over $200 million a year since then from companies that have set up in the Kyoto Protocol. It's absolutely ridiculous. Matter of fact, there was an article last year that it was in the Times, it was in the Wall Street Journal and one of the other magazines, that they said Al Gore is probably going to be the first billionaire from selling something you can't smell, taste, feel, or touch.
It's so many people, Michael. It's very interesting to me because when I have a conversation with people about global warming, virtually everybody that I know let's talk about some of the people on the left. They'll say straight out. They'll say, listen, Isn't it interesting that it's every day it seems to be hotter, the globe is changing.
Yeah, it does that. Yeah. When we were growing up as kids, right, before we had SUVs and these big giant factories all over the place. I remember in the 1940s as a child, I was in the late 40s, 1948, we had a major blizzard in New York. A temperature, we had freezing cold weather. There were times where in the 50s when I was a kid, we used to go to school in December in shirt sleeves because it was warm out. I remember taking my kids down to Manhattan once back in the early 70s. It was like 60 degrees on Christmas Day. I mean, these things happen. It's been going on like this for millions of years. You can't change it, Susan. It's got nothing to do with us.
All right, so can historical temperature data records be trusted? Haven't they been skewed by non-climate factors like instrument changes and urban heat islands?
If I told you what some of these changes were, you would laugh. Let me give you an example, okay? NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Washington, has set up ground-based temperature sensors, okay? Let me give you an example of where they are. One is in the parking lot in Tucson at the University of Arizona around a chain link fence where trucks are parking next to it, and it sits there on black macadam in the heat of the summer, and that's what they're using. Another one is at UCLA next to a cell phone tower where there's a barbecue sitting next to it, and the exhaust from the major air conditioning unit in this particular building is blowing right on the sensor. The worst one of all is set up by the IPCC from the United Nations, and if I have the photos of it, it is at the end of the runway in Rome, in Leonardo da Vinci Airport, where planes are taking off, firing their exhaust right into it, and that's what they're using. But if you use the NASA satellite data, NASA satellite data shows that the temperature has actually fallen almost 3/4 of a degree in the last 11 years. Now, if you take the NOAA charts on satellite-based data from the atmospheric temperatures from 1980 to 2010, that's 30 years, and you look at it and you base it at 1980 at zero, in 2010 the temperature actually dropped 1.25 degrees. This is global. Now, there were two spikes in those temperatures, one in 1984 and one in 1996. And the spike in those temperatures were two volcanic eruptions. So telling me that the man stops breathing and parks every car and shuts down every factory when we go to zero emissions in 12 years. You know what happens if we go to zero emissions in 12 years? No carbon dioxide, no oxygen. You can't breathe. How are the plants going to get fed and give off oxygen? I mean, this is ridiculous. It's stupid.
No, but doesn't carbon dioxide in the atmosphere come from natural sources?
Absolutely. More carbon dioxide comes. The volcano that erupted in Hawaii 6 months ago, that's probably still in some stage of eruption, not as much as it was, is pumping more carbon dioxide in the air alone than if we idled every car in America for 2 years. And that's a scientific fact. There's nothing you can change about that. Global temperatures have been changing day in and day out.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that volcanoes emit more carbon dioxide than humans. That seems to be your whole argument.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
The two volcanoes, the Pinatubo volcano in the Philippines and the El Chican Mexican volcano in eruption 1983 and 91 were the two spikes in the temperature, and it settled right back down after the volcano settled back down, and the temperature actually dropped 1.25 degrees in 2010. The other problem is everybody's laughing and the tides. I saw Al Gore gets on TV about 6 months ago, and he had an interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News, and he said, "You want to know how the ice is melting, Chris?" He said, "The ice is melting so fast that I was in Miami, and the high tide was flooding the streets." He says, "I saw fish swimming in the streets." Well, I went on social media, and I couldn't see one picture of any fish swimming in the streets. Could a fish get lost during high tide and wind up in the streets? Absolutely. It can happen.
Is our population so... I hate to use the word dumb or stupid.
They are dumb because they're following all the rhetoric without looking behind it. Here's a very simple thing that people don't even understand. And I asked 20 college kids if they knew this. I knew it in 3rd grade. Here's why. First of all, let me tell you why the tides are high in Miami. They're high all over the world. But what they don't tell you is the low tides are lower. And do you want to know why? Have you looked up in the sky at night lately? The moon is 30,000 miles closer to the Earth than ever before. The moon is the only thing that controls the tides. When the moon is closer to the Earth, we have higher tides. This year, because the moon was so close to the Earth, it actually slowed the rotation of the Earth down to that New Year's Eve actually came 1.2 seconds later. They had to adjust the atomic clocks for the first time in history. The last time the moon was this close to Earth was 1912. It caused a disruption in the tides in the ocean. What happened in 1912? An iceberg broke off in the North Sea and sunk the Titanic. Gee, where were the factories and the SUVs back in 1912?
Yeah, right. Well, before we get into some other issues concerning global warming, if you will, and the whole issue of climate change,
sure.
What's the greenhouse effect? Give people a definition of what that is, because again,
the greenhouse effect is a misnomer. Because if you think about the greenhouse effect, if you remember back in the 70s, they were concerned about hairspray and the fluorochlorohydrons. And every woman was afraid that next time she sprayed her hair, she was going to blow a hole in the atmosphere. We were going to get sucked out to Mars. Here's something: the greenhouse effect is over with, and let me tell you why. There can be a greenhouse effect. There is no problem in the world. The only problem is it's not caused by man. There's nothing we can do. Here's two words that you haven't heard in 30 years. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Acid rain. When was the last time you heard the term acid rain? There is no more.
For a very long time. I didn't even think
eliminated by George H. Bush Sr. because of his clean energy, because of his environmental bills and everything else. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. They turned around and they wanted to, I scratch my head every day when I see this stuff. And here's what they're trying to do. They come out with this new green energy thing. All the Democrats who are running now. Oh, we got to do this green energy. First of all, it costs trillions of dollars. You do that with Medicare for all and everything else they want, and the United States will be Venezuela within 2 years, and that's a fact. You just can't. It's amazing. But they come out with this stuff, and you can't believe it. Remember when they had the Cash for Clunker program? Because they wanted to save energy so they can clean up the environment. Okay, so what did they do? You got $4,500 to if you bought a new car and you turned in your clunker that got less than 20 miles to the gallon.
Yeah.
So you bought this car and you got $4,500 off the price of the car. Well, small business auto dealers are probably the smartest small businessmen around. So what did they do? They didn't discount the cars. They sold them for sticker price because you saved $4,500. What do you care? Okay, the car you turned in had to be destroyed. It couldn't be resold. So what did they do? They wound up depressing the auto parts businesses, and there was no inventory in used car sales. The third thing they did was, since they knew the government's never going to pay them on time, they made the buyer sign a note for $4,500. So the buyer signs a note for $4,500. Most of the dealers didn't get paid in the 60 days as promised, so the dealers dropped the note on the buyer. So now the buyer paid about $2,000 more for the car because it was sold at sticker price. He has a note for $4,500, so originally he's in the hole for $6,500. The government didn't pay most of the dealers on time, so they dropped the note. They overpaid so much for the car. Guess what they got at the end of the year? They got a 1099 from the government for $4,500 for forgiveness of a debt as ordinary income, so they had a $1,200 tax bill. They wound up paying about $7,000 more for that car than they would have had they just bought it on their own. The second worst thing about it is most of these people that got these cars were underwater in their houses anyway. So my theory on this is...
Let's look at the new cars, for example, that are supposed to be very cost effective because of the notion that they are, they have batteries and you can plug it in.
Well, let me tell you about the batteries. Let me tell you about the Tesla, okay? Manufacturing the Tesla puts more carbon in the air than building a Cadillac or an SUV from General Motors or Chrysler. Why? Because mining of lithium for those batteries is the dirtiest mining in the world. They are causing more havoc in the air because of mining for lithium, but they're going to do that. And what's going to happen in 10 years, in 15 years, when those batteries die and we have to dispose of them?
Right.
You can't dispose of lithium batteries, just throw them in the garbage. The landfills will be horrible. Lithium causes mesothelioma, which is asbestos cancer. That's a fact. That's a medical fact. There's nothing you can do about that. I'm not saying driving a Tesla is going to give you cancer. That's not true. The batteries, the byproduct of the batteries, if they break open, lithium is very dangerous. So
well, there's a lot of debates and disagreement among climate scientists about the causes and effects.
Well, here's the thing, okay? I'm going to tell you exactly what they say. Al Gore has gotten on television. He said the consensus of X number of the scientists is, well, but he didn't tell you that it's the only consensus of less than 400 scientists, of which, from what I understand, there were like 13 or 14 were only climatologists. But that's consensus science. You want to know what real science is? Archimedes' principle of buoyancy. There is 533,000 square miles more ice in 2013 than there was in 2012 in the Arctic Circle. Those are from satellite photos from NASA. People can look this up. It's a fact. It's an absolute fact. But Archimedes' principle is a scientific principle, not a theory, and it's not a consensus. When you displace water, it will not run over. For example, if you had a glass full of ice and it was over the rim of the glass, and you filled the glass, your listeners can do this at home as an experiment. Fill a glass with ice till the ice is above the rim of the glass, and then pour water in it right to the edge of the glass. When that ice melts, if that glass overflows, I'll fly anybody who can prove it to me to Paris and buy him dinner at the greatest restaurant in the world, first class. It can't happen. It's Archimedes' principle. If all the floating ice in the ocean, if all the sea ice melted tomorrow, we would not lose a half inch of beach anywhere in the world. And that's a scientific principle and fact. And when I talk to people and I have debates on scientific principle, and I says, well, according to Archimedes, and they say, who the hell is Archimedes? They think he's a member of Congress. They have no clue. They don't even know who he is. I learned about it in third grade. You look at an ice tray when it freezes up. The ice is above the rim. When the tray melts, does the water overflow? It comes right back to where it was.
Exactly.
Now, we're not saying that glaciers aren't different, but Greenland right now, because the glaciers are melting, they are experiencing the greatest economic boom in farming than they've had in hundreds of years, because now they got dirt, they can grow things. So they call it Greenland for a reason. It used to be green.
Yeah, everything is driven by money.
It's all money. It's absolutely money.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you something. If you were sitting on a panel with Al Gore, and Al Gore made all of these, let's call them insinuations about climate change, how would you counteract somebody who people believe is a person who knows so much about this whole
issue? Very simple. I would ask him a couple of questions, okay? Number one, I would say, Mr. Gore, it says it's a pleasure to meet you, but here's what I want to ask you a question. You said the consensus of scientists is this. Is that consensus science or is that real science? Is that a hypothesis? And why do you still call it a theory if you're so right? And number one, how many scientists were in that consensus? Because he won't answer the question. I laid down the gauntlet on a national news show about a year ago that I will give $10,000 to the charity His Choice to debate him for 30 minutes in a political in a public forum. He's never picked up the gauntlet. Whether or not he heard it, I don't know, but I'm sure he must have, or somebody must have told him. And he wouldn't do it. I mean, I could sit there and with a glass of ice on the stage and say, here, let me show what's going to happen when the ice melts. He will tell me point blank, oh, the glass is going to overflow and flood the stage. And I'm going to say, really? Let's watch. And, I mean, it just can't happen. And Chris Wallace, when he interviewed him on Fox News, had him against the ropes and didn't do a thing. You should have said to him, well, why don't you tell me why the low tides are lower? Because they are, because the moon controls the tides. And if people don't think it's true, think about this. Have your shoes felt like they've been getting tighter in the last year? Have you think you gained 3 or 4 pounds? It has to do with gravitational pull.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the impacts. Just let's make some assumptions.
Sure.
So what harm will global warming cause if it does exist?
Nothing.
Is global warming a threat to humans?
No. The only threat to humans that there may be global warming would be on a very limited scale, and it would be this: if you were in actually global cooling would probably be worse. But if you were in an area that depended on temperature controls and everything else, and I don't know. Well, the rainforest is one, okay. But I don't hear anybody crying about Brazil when they were cutting down the rainforest to plant sugar and corn for ethanol until they found oil off the coast of Brazil, and then they stopped cutting down the forest. I haven't heard anybody talking about the rainforest in years. Same way nobody's mentioned acid rain in years. It's just, are there people who may be hurt by it? Yeah, in their pocketbook if they raise taxes for this green energy stuff. But other than that, it's been millions of years, Susan, and nobody's been affected by man-made global warming. There has been climate change, and there's nothing you can do with climate change. You can't change. You can spend all the money you want. You can close all the factories you want. You can't stop the moon from changing its orbit. You can't stop the Earth from traveling around the sun that turns in certain degrees, and we have a 40-year cycle. Those are scientific, proven facts, and there's nothing man can do about it.
All right, so based upon all the things that you're saying, Michael, if you had a chance to be in front of a huge group, say a few thousand people who...
I've done this, Susan. I lecture on the last lecture I gave on global climate change was in Shanghai, believe it or not. I had 250 people in the audience. They stood there. They sat there.
World, virtually.
I had all the scientific evidence. I had slide presentations from NASA and everything else. I had pictures of the moon 10 years ago and what it is today. I had all the scientific proof that how much ice is in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and people stood there with their mouth hung open. And the questions at the end were, how come nobody's ever telling us this? I said, you're reading the wrong publications. Stop reading the newspapers. Get online. Look it up. Go to the NASA websites. Look at the satellite photos.
Yeah. So, we want to get into some other things today. So,
sure.
Just give us a final discussion or a final statement about what you would suggest people really get to know and how they do it, because I think this is a subject that could go on for days and days and days, and people will debate you, people will argue with you, even though you seem to have all the information under your belt. But based upon that, there's got to be something that you really think can finish this discussion about climate change.
Well, the only thing I can tell you is this, very, very simple. The Earth is viewed as a static place. It's not a static place. The Earth has been traveling around the sun at 18,000 miles an hour. It's traveling around its own orbit at 17,000 miles an hour. There is no way in the world we can change it. To believe that over the billions of years that the planet has been there, and all its changes that we've gone through, there is nothing you can do. There is nothing you can do or I can do to change it. All we have to do is when these changes come around, we have to learn to live with them. When it rains outside, you take an umbrella. When it snows outside, you warm up the snowplow. There's nothing you can do or I can do. I wish we could. It's just impossible.
Well,
it's impossible. Basically, if the Earth was able to talk to us, it would say something like, don't try to change me. I can do it on my own. I have been doing it for the last 50 million years. I rest my case. That's all you can do.
Well, let's get into something else.
Sure.
You told me this morning, and I didn't know about this, that there has been a real horror going on today with regard to somebody who's part of the administration. Let's tell our audience a little bit about.
Well, it wasn't our administration. Apparently, according to the news reports, Alan Kruger, who was the Obama's economic advisor, and he was also an advisor to the Clintons campaign, and also everything else, at 58 years of age, apparently committed suicide over the weekend. We don't know if he was under investigation or what. There's no reason for it, but he was a renowned economist. His biggest thing was his studies on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which was absolutely ridiculous. When you think about the ramifications of that, it's crazy. More people are losing jobs because in the cities and the states that have done that than anywhere else. I mean, Oregon and Washington raised it to $15 an hour, and all the fast food restaurants got rid of their clerks and put in tablets. You walk in there, you don't see any people anymore.
And that's an interesting subject as well, the subject of what is going to happen to the jobs that the computers are going to take over and the robots are going to be taking over.
Well, most of those jobs are, starting, for example, in fast food restaurants are low-paying jobs anyway. But those are, they pay about $9, $10, $11 an hour, not $15. Here's what people don't realize, and this is a fact. They can look it up. The numbers I'm about to give you are averages across the country. Okay, perfect example. Social workers nationwide with a master's in social work. Starting salary is approximately $30,000 a year. Now that's a national average. They may make 40 in New York, they may make 20 in Utah or whatever, but the national average is about $30,000 a year. Police officers nationally, on average, starting salary is about $24,000 a year. Most of them have college. Most school teachers in the United States, starting salaries on the average across the nation, because there are little towns that have 10 teachers in it, and there are big cities who make a lot of more money. But the average salary across the country starting salary is about $31,000 a year. In Florida, substitute teachers make $13 an hour. We're going to give these kids at $15 an hour, $32,000 a year for flipping hamburgers and scooping ice cream, because that's what $15 an hour is, $31,600 a year on a 40-hour work week. That's ridiculous. Flipping hamburgers, working at McDonald's, delivering newspapers or whatever it was growing up when I was a kid, and my kids' grandchildren had jobs. It's amazing, but their starting wages, they're introducing them to the workplace. It's not the money that they're earning; it's the amount of that. What are we going to do with kids now? Where a kid's going to turn around to his father and says, "Hey, I want $15 an hour in allowance."
Well,
I mean, I was a kid. When I was a kid, I got $3 a week in an allowance. Of course, the economy was different then, and so was the cost of living. It lasted me for a whole week. But my kids grow up. They got $10 a week. But I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. Where are they going to take this?
So where is Michael Solomon going from here? I know that you're in the process.
I'm not running for president, believe me.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the book that you're in the process of writing.
Well, the one I finished, which was finished 2 years ago, oddly enough, was The Conversion Prophecy. It dealt with the Islamic takeover of the world without firing a shot. It takes place 20 years from now, and the world's at peace. And what happened is, over those 20 years, actually since 1991, they have been buying up stock in corporations all over the world by opening up 900 little brokerage houses, the way Disney bought the land in Orlando, Florida. And suddenly one day at a G20 conference, they announced to the world, we own all these corporations, the CEOs are really Muslims, and you either fly to the Islamic flag or we take over the world and starve you into submission. Of course, there's a hero involved in the secret society, but oddly enough, 3 things that I wrote in the book about corporate takeovers, 14 of them have already occurred, which surprised the hell out of me. But the biggest problem, one of the things I wrote in the book, that where they were getting the money from to buy up all the stock, was from an illegal pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in Iran, who was pumping fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine through the cartel in South America into the U.S. at $12 billion a month.
Wow. And
what happened was, about 6 months ago, they discovered a memo that President Obama had written to the DEA. It was in an email that he wrote to the DEA to shut down the investigation of the secret pharmaceutical plant in Iran. Now, I wrote that as conjecture 2.5 years ago, and now here it is 2 years later, and it's come true. The mergers and acquisitions I mentioned in my book that were going to happen happened. I talked about Verizon being the only internet provider in the world. 6 weeks after the book was released, they bought AOL, they then bought Yahoo, and there's a rumor going on that they're looking for a part of Google. I said that there would be, by 2020, there'll only be 2 major national airlines in the United States. Since the U.S. Air and American Airline merger, we're down to 3. There's only 1 to go, and there'll only be 2 left. Carlo Goshen, who oddly enough wound up being arrested by the Japanese 6 months ago,
yes,
made a statement last summer in France. He's a Lebanese who owned Renault and Nissan, that by the year 2022, there'll be 1 auto manufacturer in the world who will control 80% of the industry. I said that in my book 2 years ago. So all of these things, people look at me and they say, "What are you, Nostradamus?" and no, believe me, not. Far from it. I wish I was. I could pick the lottery numbers.
There you
we
go.
wouldn't be having this phone call. I'd be calling you from Tahiti. But somebody said to me, "If you can have one wish in the world, what would it be?" I said, 5 lottery numbers. I said, "There's 6 to win." I said, "I'll figure out the last one. Don't worry about it." But
well, Okay, with that in mind, we want to finish up the show
Sure.
because there's so much information that you offered our audience, and I think it would be really neat to finish on the note that I always finish on, which is I want to give you the last word, Michael, because there must be so much on your mind that you would like to talk about. So let our audience know a little bit about what.
The last word is this. Number one, take responsibility for what your kids are learning in school. I saw a video last night of a person who grabbed about 12 college kids off the street. They had a world map. It was just an outline of the countries, and they gave them a pointer, and they said, could you name any country on the map? One of them pointed to Africa and said it was the United States. Another one pointed to South America. Yeah, I kid you not. Another one pointed to South America and said, isn't that Canada? And I mean, I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. These are literally true. When I went to school, we learned everything. I mean, I could have recited. Today, I probably can't anymore because my memory's getting a little lax. But we used to know every president of the United States in order, who they were, what they were. You know, most of the vice presidents too. I mean, they don't teach civics like they should in school. My theory is I want the 26th Amendment to the Constitution to say that anybody running for public office in Washington, in order to run, you must pass the civics exam. When I think of what this AOC, this Alexandria Ocasio, the statements she's making, I gotta scratch my head.
Scary,
I mean, when she came out and said if people who had the right to own guns would be in the Constitution, I said, my God, this girl hasn't even read it.
She hasn't. No.
You know.
No.
So here's my advice to anybody out there right now. Don't read past the headlines, but don't stop at the articles. Don't read just the articles themselves, because somewhere's buried in areas of truth, and it's not good because it's their truth. It's not your truth. If something sounds too good to be true, it is. Look it up. The Internet is the greatest source in the world. The encyclopedia, which we don't have anymore because it's all online, is the greatest source in the world. You want to know if there's ice growing in the Antarctic? Go to the NASA website. Look at the satellite photos. They're there. They're there. You want to know if the moon is 31,000 miles closer to the Earth and it controls the tides? Go to the NASA site and you'll see it. It's there. All the pictures are there. And I don't have to tell you. You look up at night in the last 6 months, you see the size of the full moon. It's frightening. But people don't do it. Look up Archimedes. Look what he's done. Look at the theory of buoyancy. And stop saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. If this is a principle, you got to remember that these people are talking theory. It's conjecture. It's a hypothesis. It has not been proven. So, I mean, that's part of it all. I mean, and you know, the most dangerous person in the United States is an educated voter. Get educated.
Get educated is right. Now, just last but not least, do you want to make a prediction who is going to run for office again? Do you believe that Trump is going to run, and who else is going to run against him?
Trump is going to win. He's going to win by a bigger margin, electoral margin, than he had last time, as long as the economy stays the way it is.
So you want to make
20 out of the 20 candidates that the Democrats have right now, or 22, I don't know, it's growing like by leaps and bounds. By the end of the year, every Democrat in Congress will probably be running for president. I would say that out of those 22 candidates, none of them are going to be on a ballot, except maybe one, possibly Joe Biden. But if he keeps up the gaffes that he started, I mean, in his first speech last week, he mentioned that Margaret Thatcher didn't like Trump as president. Thatcher's been dead for 4 years. I mean, well, she died in 2013. She's been dead for over 5 years. So I got to scratch my head, and I'm saying, you know, if anybody should take a civics test, maybe it's him. But it's frightening. It's just frightening. But to be honest with you, I think Trump's going to win hands down. I made it. You know, it's funny because I made this prediction the first time he won, and people didn't believe it. I even named the states he was going to win. I said he was going to win Pennsylvania, and he was going to win Wisconsin and Michigan, and everybody looked at me. They had two heads. And they said, how can you say that? I says, well, he gets up in West Virginia and says, we're going to close the coal mine. She gets up in West Virginia and says, we're going to close the coal mines. I said, they heard that in Western Pennsylvania, too. Who's got coal mines?
Right. And I'm sure
I said she didn't go to Wisconsin because she took it for granted. She didn't go to Michigan. She took it for granted. Yeah. California just passed they claimed I haven't seen the bill. I mean, in the newspapers, there's been a claim that California said that unless Trump releases his tax returns, they're not going to put him on the ballot. Well, here's my answer to that. There isn't a Republican who can win California if they tried. So they just saved him all kinds of campaign money, campaigning out there. He's not going to be on the ballot. Who cares? Does it matter?
Well, my guest today has been Michael Solomon, who is a pundit. He's an author. He's got that have been on the shelves for a long time that are bestsellers. He's going to be writing other books, and I think everybody ought to just take a look for anything that Michael Solomon is involved in, because if you want to really learn a lot, he's the person who is going to be able to help you do that. With that said, thank you so much for being on the Susan Brender Show. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, Susan. And just tell your listeners to remember the truth always prevails.
Thank you for listening to The Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.